The sun was already beating down hard on the asphalt by the time the parking lot started to fill up. It was that kind of heat that sits heavy on your shoulders, the kind that makes the air shimmer just a little bit above the ground. For most people, a day like this was just another hot Friday in July. But for the woman sitting in the front seat of her battered sedan, it was the most important day of her life. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror one last time. She wasn't a young woman anymore. There were deep lines around her eyes, and streaks of gray in her hair that she hadn't bothered to dye. She wanted to look nice, though. She wanted her son to see her and know that she was proud, that she had held the fort down while he was away. She adjusted the collar of her blouse. It was a nice light blue color, one of the few things she had bought new in years. She smoothed out the fabric with hands that were rough and calloused from years of working 2 jobs. Sometimes 3, just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her purse and the small bag she had packed with snacks and water, knowing the ceremony would be long. She stepped out of the car and closed the door, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air. Around her, families were gathering. There were fathers with video cameras already hoisted on their shoulders. Mothers herding young children who were too young to understand the gravity of the occasion. And grandparents sitting on folding chairs near the trunks of their cars. The air smelled of sunscreen, hot asphalt, and the faint scent of diesel fuel from the idling buses nearby. It was a smell that triggered memories for her. It reminded her of the day she had dropped him off at the bus station all those months ago. He had looked so young then, just a boy with a backpack and a scared look in his eyes, stepping into a world he didn't know. Today, he wouldn't be a boy anymore. Today, he would be a Marine. She walked toward the entrance gates, joining the slow stream of people. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual. She felt a mix of nervousness and excitement that made her stomach do flip-flops. She found her seat in the bleachers, which were already crowded. It was a sea of people, all buzzing with conversation and anticipation. She squeezed past knees and strollers, murmuring soft excuse, mes and sorries, until she found an empty spot near the aisle. It wasn't the best seat, but it had a clear view of the parade deck where the ceremony would take place. As she sat down, she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket. She unfolded it carefully. It was a picture of her son. It wasn't a professional photo, just a snapshot she had taken on her phone the day before he left. But she had printed it out and laminated it so it wouldn't get ruined. She touched the photo with her thumb, tracing the outline of his smile. He looked so happy in that picture, full of hope. She remembered the day he told her he wanted to join. They had been sitting at the kitchen table, eating a simple dinner of spaghetti. He had just graduated high school, and the future was a big, scary question mark for him. He had told her that he wanted to do something that mattered. He wanted to make something of himself. He wanted to serve. At first, she had been terrified. Every mother worries when their child signs up for the military. She worried about the danger, about the distance, about the unknown. But looking at him across that table, seeing the determination in his eyes, she knew she couldn't stand in his way. She had spent his whole life teaching him to be strong, to stand up for what he believed in, and to work hard. How could she say no when he was finally ready to do all those things? So she supported him. She helped him pack. She drove him to the recruiter. And she held back her tears when he walked out the door, not wanting him to worry about her. That was her job. Her job was to be the strong one, the rock he could always come back to. The hours began to pass. The heat intensified. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The plastic bench was hard and uncomfortable, but she didn't care. She sat upright, her eyes fixed on the empty field in front of her. She didn't talk much to the people sitting next to her, though they were friendly enough. She just wanted to be ready. She wanted to make sure she didn't miss a single second. Around her, the crowd grew restless. Small children started to whine, and parents checked their watches. But she remained still, a statue of patience. She was used to waiting. She had waited tables for 20 years. She had waited in line at the grocery store, counting coupons. She had waited by the phone for news. She was good at waiting. Suddenly, a low hum of chatter rippled through the stands. The energy shifted instantly. People started to stand up, craning their necks to get a better look. In the distance, she could see them. Columns of green and brown moving in perfect unison. The sound of drums began to beat, a rhythmic, steady thrum that seemed to vibrate right through the metal bleachers. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt a little shaky, but she ignored them. She gripped the railing in front of her with both hands. Her eyes scanned the hundreds of marching figures, all dressed identically, all moving as one body. They looked so strong, so disciplined. It was hard to recognize anyone in the sea of covers and uniforms. She squinted against the bright sunlight. She pulled her sunglasses down to the tip of her nose to see better. She knew his height. She knew the way he walked. She just had to find him. The platoons marched closer, their boots hitting the pavement with a sound like thunder. The instructors walked alongside them, barking orders that were lost in the distance. She searched every face that passed by. They were all so young, yet their faces were set with the seriousness of grown men and women. They looked tired, but proud. They had survived the hardest weeks of their lives. They had earned their place on that field. And then she saw him. He was in the third row. He looked taller than she remembered. His shoulders were back, his chin up high. He had a new haircut, of course, and his face was tanned from the sun, but it was him. It was definitely him. A tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just let it fall. She felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost knocked her over. That was her son. That was the boy she had taught to tie his shoes. That was the boy who had scraped his knee riding his bike. That was the boy who had held her hand when his father passed away. And now, here he was, a United States Marine. Marching across the parade deck with the confidence of a warrior, she wanted to scream his name. She wanted to jump up and down and wave her arms. But she knew she couldn't. She had to be respectful. This was his moment. But she also felt a desperate need to capture this moment. She needed to show him later that she was there. She needed to prove to herself that this was real, that she hadn't just dreamed it. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. She fumbled around for a moment before her fingers wrapped around the cool metal of her camera. It was an old digital camera, nothing fancy, but it took good pictures. She pulled it out and turned it on. The little blue light blinking to life. As the formation got closer, she knew she had to act fast. They were going to march past her and then turn, and she might lose sight of him. She leaned forward over the railing, stretching as far as she could without falling into the aisle. She held the camera up to her eye, trying to focus the lens. But the people in the stands were starting to stand up too. A tall man in a wide-brimmed hat stepped right in front of her, blocking her view. Panic started to rise in her chest. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let him walk by without getting at least one clear picture. She shifted to the left, trying to find a gap between shoulders and heads. She wasn't trying to be rude. She wasn't trying to cause a scene. She was just a mother who wanted to see her son. So, without thinking, she took a small step into the aisle. It was just a half step, really. Just enough to get a clear line of sight. She could see him now, marching right toward her. She raised the camera, her heart pounding in her ears. She waited for the exact moment when he would be in focus. The drums beat louder. The boots thundered on the ground. She was so close. Just a few more seconds. The camera shutter clicked. It was a tiny, sharp sound in the middle of all that noise, but to her, it sounded like a gunshot. She froze for a second, looking at the small digital screen on the back of the camera. The image was blurry. The sun had glared right across the lens, turning her son into a dark smudge against a wash of bright white light. Panic flared in her chest. She couldn't let this be the only picture she had. Not after all these months. Not after everything they had been through. She looked up quickly. The platoon was still marching, moving with that slow, rhythmic power that makes the ground feel like it's vibrating. Her son was getting closer. She could see the determination in his face now, the sweat on his forehead. He was looking straight ahead, focused on nothing but the flag in the distance. She had one more chance. She just needed a clear shot. She needed to get a little bit higher, just a few inches. So the heads in front of her wouldn't block him out. She took another step into the aisle. It was a quiet space meant for walking, but right now, it was the only place where she could see. She lifted the camera again, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. She held her breath to steady her arms. She was so focused on the boy in the brown uniform that she didn't hear the footsteps coming up fast behind her. "You need to sit down." The voice was loud and sharp, cutting through the sound of the drums like a knife. It startled her so much that she nearly dropped the camera. She jerked around, her heart racing, expecting to see a friend or maybe a family member who wanted to squeeze past. Instead, she found herself staring at a chest. It was a broad chest covered in a dark blue uniform with a shiny badge pinned right in the center. She looked up, blinking against the sun. It was a security guard. He was a big man, taller than most, with a face that looked tired and hot. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but she could see the irritation there. He was wiping sweat from his neck with a handkerchief, clearly not in the mood for any problems. "I'm sorry," she stammered, clutching the camera tight against her chest. "I'm just trying to get a picture. That's my son down there." She pointed a trembling finger toward the parade deck, desperate to make him understand. Most people, if you told them your son was graduating, they would soften up. They would smile, and maybe even offer to take a picture for you. But this man didn't soften. His jaw just got tighter. "I don't care who it is," he said, his voice flat and unyielding. "You're blocking the aisle. You're blocking the view of the people behind you. Sit down now." The people sitting behind her leaned forward, whispering. Some of them looked annoyed that she was standing, while others looked sympathetic, whispering things like, "Let her take the picture." But the guard wasn't listening to the whispers. He was just looking at his watch and then back at her. He had a job to do, and he wanted to do it as easily as possible, so he could get back into the shade. "Please," she begged, turning back to the field for a split second. Her son was almost directly in front of her. This was the moment. "He's right there. Just 10 seconds, please." She started to lift the camera again. She didn't mean to be defiant. She was just a mother acting on instinct. But the guard saw it differently. He saw someone ignoring a direct order. He saw a disruption in the middle of a formal ceremony. His patience, which was paper-thin to begin with, snapped completely. He stepped forward aggressively, closing the small gap between them. He reached out and grabbed her upper arm with a grip that was much harder than necessary. It wasn't a gentle tap or a guiding touch. It was a rough, tight grip that dug into her skin. "I said, sit down." He barked, loud enough that the people in the row in front of them turned around to look. The pain in her arm shocked her. She stumbled back. The heavy camera swung from the strap around her wrist, banging against her hip. She tried to pull her arm away, frightened by the sudden aggression. "You're hurting me," she cried out. "Let go." The guard didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her toward him, trying to force her back into her seat. The crowd gasped. The atmosphere shifted instantly from excitement to alarm. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was a place of honor and celebration. It's not a place where a mother was being manhandled by security. She was crying now, tears of fear and frustration mixing with the sweat on her face. "I just want a picture," she screamed, her voice cracking. It was a sound full of raw helplessness. "Why won't you let me take a picture of my son?" Because she was struggling to stay upright and keep her eyes on the field, the guard lost his temper. He grabbed her other arm, locking both of her wrists in his big hands, and started to drag her toward the exit stairs. He wasn't asking anymore. He was removing her. "That's it," he growled, leaning close to her face. "You're out. You're done." She stumbled over her own feet, her balance gone. Her legs felt like jelly. She looked back over her shoulder one last time. She could see her son's platoon turning the corner. He was gone. The moment was gone. The one thing she had waited months for, the one thing she had lived for, was being stolen from her by a man who just wanted to clear an aisle. The people around them were starting to stand up now. Not to watch the graduates, but to watch the fight. "Hey, leave her alone," a man shouted from a few rows back.
She wasn't doing anything wrong,
a woman yelled. But the security guard didn't seem to care about the crowd. He was too focused on winning this small battle of wills. He twisted her arms, pulling her up the first step of the concrete stairs. The pain made her wince, and she let out a small cry. She felt small and humiliated. Here she was, surrounded by thousands of people, being treated like a criminal. All she wanted was to be a mother. They reached the top of the stairs, near the concrete railing. The guard shoved her against it, letting go of one arm to reach for his radio. He was going to call for backup. He was going to have her escorted off the base entirely. She leaned against the rough concrete, panting, her chest heaving. Her makeup was running. Her nice blue blouse was sticking to her back with sweat. And her arms were throbbing where he had grabbed her. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the ceremony below. "I haven't done anything. Disrupting a military ceremony is a serious offense, lady," he spat back, speaking into his shoulder radio. "I need a supervisor at Section 4, Aisle 12. I've got a hostile subject." The word hostile hung in the hot air. It seemed so ridiculous. Hostile. She was a mother holding a camera. She was tired and hot and emotional, but she wasn't dangerous. She looked over the railing, down into the bowl of the stadium. The graduates were far away now, just a block of color moving in the distance. She felt a crushing weight in her stomach. She had missed it. She had been dragged away just as the most important moment of her son's life was happening. The crowd around them was getting louder. The mood was turning ugly. People were pulling out their phones, recording the scene. They were shouting at the guard to stop. But he stood there like a wall, his back to the graduates, his chest puffed out, daring anyone to challenge him. He thought he was in control. He thought he was the authority. He had no idea that he was being watched. Not just by the crowd, but by a group of men sitting in the very back row. Men who knew a thing or two about honor and about respecting a mother's sacrifice. The guard was busy radioing for help, feeling proud of himself for keeping order, while behind him a wall of very large, very quiet men began to move. Down on the parade deck, the atmosphere was one of intense focus. Hundreds of new Marines stood in perfect formation, their backs straight, their eyes forward. They were trained to ignore distractions, to be like stone in the face of chaos. But inside those uniforms, they were still human. They were still sons and daughters. Their ears were straining to hear the sounds of the crowd, trying to pick out a familiar voice, a cheer, a shout. Her son stood in the third row. He was sweating in the heavy wool uniform, his face stinging from the sun, but his mind was clear. He was thinking about the flag, about the emblem on his cover, about the oath he had taken. But then, a sound cut through the rhythmic beating of the drums and the barked commands of the drill instructors. It wasn't a cheer. It wasn't applause. It was a scream. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound that he recognized instantly. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. Not since he had fallen off his bike when he was 7 and scraped his knees so badly he couldn't walk. It was the sound of his mother in genuine distress. His heart skipped a beat. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to break formation, to run to her. But years of training and the iron grip of discipline held him in place. His muscles tensed up, rock hard. His jaw clenched until it hurt. He stared straight ahead, but his eyes were wide with panic. He could feel the shift in the platoon around him. Other recruits had heard it too. The air felt electric. The drill instructors, sensing the break in focus, began to shout louder, their voices hoarse and aggressive, trying to maintain control of the formation. But the damage was done. The connection between the mother and son was too strong to be broken by a marching order. Above them, in the stands, the situation was getting out of hand. The security guard had finally gotten a response on his radio. He was nodding, barking into the device, his face red with exertion and anger. He had one hand clamped around the mother's arm, pinning her against the metal railing. She wasn't fighting him anymore. She had gone limp, sobbing quietly into her hands, defeated. The camera dangled from her wrists, swinging like a broken pendulum. She just wanted to disappear. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole, to take her away from this humiliation. The crowd was not having it. The people sitting nearby, who had been watching this unfold with growing horror, were no longer passive observers. An older man in the row directly behind the scuffle stood up. He was wearing a Vietnam veteran hat, his face weathered and serious. "Hey," he shouted, pointing a finger at the guard. "Leave her alone. She wasn't doing anything." A young woman next to him stood up too, her phone raised, recording the whole thing. "You're hurting her," she yelled. "Get your hands off her." The guard ignored them. He squeezed the radio tighter and tried to pull the mother up the stairs again. "Clear the aisle," he yelled at the crowd, trying to assert his dominance. "Everyone sit down or I'll have you all removed." He was a man who had let a little bit of power go to his head. He thought the badge on his chest made him the king of this little concrete world. He thought that because he was enforcing a rule, he was in the right, regardless of how cruel he was being. He didn't see the people around him as human beings with feelings. He saw them as a crowd that needed to be managed, but he made a fatal mistake. In his focus on the crying woman and the angry crowd in front of him, he forgot to check what was happening behind him. He didn't notice the silence that had fallen over the top row of the section. He didn't see the 12 men who had been watching the ceremony with quiet respect stand up in unison. These men didn't look angry. They didn't look like they were trying to start a riot. They moved with a calm, fluid purpose that was terrifying to witness. They were dressed simply, in jeans and polo shirts, or in their old service uniforms with the ribbons pinned over their hearts. Some wore caps that gave away who they were: the gold trident, the wings, the insignia of the elite. But even without the symbols, you could tell by the way they stood. Shoulders back, chins level, eyes scanning the threat, they moved down the stairs of the stadium like a pack of wolves, stepping silently, quickly, and with absolute coordination. They didn't push people out of the way. The crowd parted for them instinctively. Sensing the authority radiating from them, the first of the men to reach the bottom was a giant of a person. He had a thick gray beard and arms like tree trunks. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked up to the security guard and placed a heavy hand on the guard's shoulder. The guard flinched and spun around, ready to shout at whoever was touching him. When he looked up, he saw a wall of chests. 12 men standing shoulder to shoulder, looking down at him. The color drained from the guard's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had dealt with drunks and rowdy teenagers before. He had dealt with angry parents, but he had never dealt with anything like this. The big man in front leaned in. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice was low, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate right through the guard's chest. "Take your hands off her," the man said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, his brain trying to process the situation. He looked at the woman, then back at the wall of men. His pride was fighting with his survival instinct. "She's breaking the rules," the guard stammered, his voice suddenly weak and high-pitched. "I have to remove her." "She is a guest," the man said, taking a half-step closer, invading the guard's personal space. "And she is not going anywhere." The air around them seemed to stop moving. The shouting from the crowd died down as everyone watched the standoff. The security guard, realizing he was completely outmatched and surrounded, slowly released his grip on the woman's arm. He took a step back, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. The anger had left him, replaced by a distinct look of fear. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. "You're done," the big man said simply. He turned his back on the guard, dismissing him completely. The man bent down and gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. His touch was the opposite of the guard's. It was soft, steady, and reassuring. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. The mother looked up, her vision blurry with tears. She saw the kind eyes of the stranger, and behind him, the other 11 men standing like a protective shield. She nodded, unable to speak, wiping her face with her sleeve. The man nodded back and then looked down toward the field. He saw the platoon of recruits still standing at attention. He saw the young man in the third row who was practically vibrating with tension. "All right, boys," the big man whispered to the others, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "Let's show them what it looks like." The 12 men turned as one unit to face the parade deck. The security guard took another step back, shrinking into the shadows, realizing that the show was no longer his to run. The real show was just beginning. The security guard didn't know what to do with himself. He stood there for a moment, looking small and confused, his clipboard held awkwardly against his chest. The authority he had felt just seconds ago had completely evaporated, replaced by a heavy, sinking feeling in his gut. He looked at the 12 men blocking his path, then at the hundreds of eyes staring at him, waiting to see what he would do. He wisely decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He mumbled something into his radio, turned on his heel, and hurried up the stairs, eager to put as much distance between himself and the situation as possible. With the threat gone, the attention of the entire section shifted back to the group of men standing near the railing. They weren't just a random bunch of angry dads. They moved with a synchronized precision that was mesmerizing to watch. It was the kind of movement that only comes from years of training together, from trusting the man next to you with your life. The big man with the gray beard, who seemed to be their leader, stepped closer to the mother. She was still trying to compose herself, sniffling and smoothing her hair. It's embarrassed that so many people were watching her fall apart. He gently reached out and took the camera from her trembling hand. He checked the screen, saw the blurry photo, and looked at her with a soft, understanding expression. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, his voice low and kind. "We're going to get you that picture. Just you wait." He turned to his brothers and gave a sharp nod. Without a single word being spoken, the 12 men formed a line. They spaced themselves out perfectly, shoulder to shoulder, creating a human wall directly in front of the mother. They weren't blocking her view. They were clearing it. By standing there, they forced the people in the rows below to stay seated and kept the aisle open. They were creating a tunnel of vision just for her. Then, something incredible happened that the mother would never forget. The leader looked down at the parade deck, right at the section where the new Marines were standing. He raised his hand in a crisp military signal. He wasn't shouting for attention. He didn't need to. His presence was commanding enough. On the field, the ceremony was winding down. The recruits had been standing at attention for a long time. Their legs were cramping, and their backs were aching. But discipline held them in place. However, the young man in the third row had noticed the movement in the stands. He saw the line of men forming. He saw his mother standing behind them, wiping her eyes. He saw the security guard retreating. A wave of relief washed over him, so strong it nearly buckled his knees. The leader of the SEALs locked eyes with the young Marine. It was a look of recognition, a silent communication between warriors. The older man had trained thousands of young men, but he knew this one. He knew the heart that beat inside that chest. He slowly brought his hand up to his brow, his fingers straight and stiff. He saluted. It wasn't a lazy, half-hearted salute. It was sharp, perfect, and full of respect. As one, the 11 men beside him snapped to attention and rendered the same salute. 12 of the most elite warriors the world had ever seen, saluting a brand new Marine. The silence in the stadium was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. The crowd watched in awe, realizing they were witnessing a moment that money couldn't buy. Down on the field, the young recruit felt his throat tighten. He had been through hell to get here. He had been yelled at, exhausted, pushed to his breaking point, and then pushed further. He had missed his mother. He had doubted himself. But looking up at that row of men, seeing the respect they were giving him, and by extension, his mother, he felt a surge of pride that made his chest feel like it would burst. He knew he wasn't supposed to move. He wasn't supposed to break formation. But this was different. This was an honor he couldn't refuse. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he returned the salute. It was a small movement, but it meant everything. It was a sign of respect to the men above him, and a thank you for protecting his mother. Seeing this, the drill instructors, who were usually so strict, did something unheard of. They didn't scream. They didn't push him back into place. One of them, a tough veteran with a chest full of ribbons, simply nodded and turned his head, allowing the moment to happen. He understood the code. You always take care of the family. The big man lowered his salute and turned back to the mother. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to her. "All right, ma'am," he said gently. "He's looking right at you. Are you ready?" She took the handkerchief, wiped her face one last time, and nodded. She picked up her camera. Her hands were steady now. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't scared. She felt surrounded by strength, protected by these strangers who had become her guardians, She stood up straight, holding the camera to her eye. Through the lens, she saw her son clearly. He wasn't a blur anymore. He was smiling. It was a small, tight smile, but it reached his eyes. She pressed the button. Click. The sound was lost in the air, but she felt it in her heart. She took another picture, and then one more. She captured him standing tall, proud, and safe. She captured the image of the 12 men standing in front of her, a wall of honor. She knew these photos would be the most important things she owned. The crowd, realizing the moment had passed, erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. People were standing up, cheering not just for the graduates, but for the small drama that had unfolded, and for the happy ending they had all witnessed. The atmosphere in the stands changed completely. The tension that the security guard had created was gone, replaced by a warm, communal feeling of joy. The SEALs didn't stick around for the applause. They weren't there for the glory. As the mother lowered her camera, her face beaming with gratitude, the leader simply touched the brim of his cap. "Semper Fi, Mama," he said softly. Then just as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and began to walk back up the stairs. They moved through the crowd, people patting them on the back and shaking their hands, thanking them for what they had done. They accepted the gratitude with humble nods, disappearing back into the sea of people. Leaving the mother alone with her view and her son, she looked back down at the field. The platoon was starting to move, marching toward the exit where the families would meet them. She knew she had to hurry. She had to get down there. She had to hold him. But for a moment, she just stood there, looking at the empty spot where the 12 men had stood. She didn't know their names. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew that because of them, this day was perfect. She packed her camera carefully into her purse, making sure the lens was covered. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the hot air. She didn't feel the heat anymore. She felt light as a feather. She began to make her way down the stairs, a new spring in her step. She was ready to hug her son. She was ready to tell him everything. And she knew that no matter what happened next, they would always remember the day 12 warriors stepped in to save a mother's moment. As the ceremony came to an official close, the barriers around the parade deck were finally lifted. It was like a dam breaking. Families poured out of the stands, a river of people rushing toward the field. All of them driven by the same desperate need to hug the person they had missed for so long. The air was suddenly filled with happy screams, laughter, and the sound of hundreds of cell phones taking photos. She moved with the crowd, but she felt like she was walking on air. The fear and the humiliation from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a buzzing energy. She clutched her purse tight against her chest, protecting the camera inside like it held gold bullion. The photos she had taken were safe, but she needed the real thing now. She needed to feel the rough fabric of his uniform and smell the scent of laundry detergent that always seemed to cling to him. Even after all this time, reaching the edge of the pavement where the new Marines were gathering was harder than she expected. It was a sea of digital camo and covers, with recruits hugging their parents, their girlfriends, and their children. She stood on her tiptoes, scanning the chaos. She was shorter than most people there, and for a second, the panic tried to creep back in. What if she couldn't find him? What if she got separated in the mob? And then she saw him. He was standing a few feet away, looking around with wide eyes. He looked taller, broader, and older than the boy she had dropped off at the bus station. He looked like a man. She didn't call his name. She didn't need to. Their eyes locked across the distance, and it was like a magnet clicked into place. His face broke into a huge, genuine grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He forgot about protocol for a second and took 2 long strides toward her. Closing the gap, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She just squeezed him as hard as she possibly could, half expecting to wake up and find it was all a dream. But he was solid. He was real. He was warm. "I'm here, Mom," he whispered into her ear. His voice was deeper, rougher than she remembered. "I made it." "I know," she sobbed, not caring who was watching. "I know," I'm so proud of you. I'm so, so proud." They held on to each other for a long time while the world swirled around them. She could feel his heart beating against hers, steady and strong. She pulled back eventually, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing at herself for crying so much. "Look at you," she said, smoothing down the collar of his coat. "You look so handsome. Your father would have been." She choked up a little, swallowing the lump in her throat. He would have been so proud. He looked at her, his expression turning serious. He reached up and gently touched her arm. "I saw what happened, Mom," he said softly. "Up in the stands. I saw the guard grab you." Her smile faltered a little. She didn't want him to know. She wanted his day to be perfect. "It's okay," she said quickly. "It was just a misunderstanding. It's over now." "No, it's not okay," he said, his jaw tightening that familiar way. "I wanted to jump the ropes and come up there. I was so mad." She put a hand on his cheek. "You couldn't do that. You had a job to do. And besides," she lowered her voice, glancing over her shoulder toward the top of the stands, "you had some pretty good backup." He followed her gaze. The stadium was emptying out, but he knew who she was talking about. He scanned the rows until he saw them. The 12 men were still up there, lingering near the exit, watching over the scene like guardian angels. They were talking amongst themselves, laughing, but their presence was still felt, even from down on the field. "Who were they?" her son asked, awe in his voice. "I saw them line up. I saw the salute. I've never seen anything like that." "I don't know their names," she admitted. "But one of them had a Navy Trident hat on. They were SEALs, or used to be. They saw that man bothering me, and they just stepped in. They formed a wall so I could see you." Her son shook his head slowly. That's incredible. They didn't have to do that." "No, they didn't," she said. "But that's the kind of men they are, and that's the kind of man you are now. You're part of a family that looks out for each other." He pulled her into another hug, squeezing her tight. "I'm just glad you're okay," he said. "I'm better than okay," she smiled. "I have my son back, and I have the pictures to prove it." They spent the next hour walking around the base, meeting his fellow recruits and their families. Everyone was beaming with that unique glow of accomplishment. But everywhere they went, people kept stopping her. "Excuse me, ma'am," a woman would say, tapping her on the shoulder. "I saw what those guys did for you up there. That was amazing." Or a tall man in a veteran's hat would nod at her son and say, "Your mom's tough, son. She stood her ground, and she's got some powerful friends." It turned out that in a stadium full of thousands of people, word travels fast. The story of the mother, the security guard, and the 12 SEALs had already become the talk of the graduation. It wasn't just a story about conflict. It had become a story about community. It showed everyone there that even when things go wrong, when people are unkind or unfair, there are still good people in the world who are willing to stand up and do the right thing. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long orange shadows across the parade deck, the family started to make their way back to the car. The day was winding down. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving a peaceful tiredness in its place. They walked past the security checkpoint where the initial confrontation had happened. The guard who had dragged her was nowhere to be seen. He had likely been sent away or reassigned to a post far away from the public eye. But standing near the gate, leaning against a concrete pillar, was the leader of the group of 12. He saw them coming and pushed himself off the pillar, standing up straight. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't look angry either. He just looked respectful. Her son stopped walking immediately. He straightened his back, assuming the position of attention out of pure instinct and respect. He looked at the older man with a look of pure reverence. "At ease," the older man said with a chuckle, walking over to them. He stuck out a hand toward the son. "You did good today, son. You made your mother proud. That's the only mission that matters." The son took the hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you, sir. Thank you for helping her." The man turned to the mother. His eyes were kind, crinkled at the corners from years of smiling in the sun. "You got the picture?" he asked. She patted her purse. "I got it," she said. "I got it all. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my day. You don't need to thank us, he said, glancing back at his buddies who were waiting by the cars. We look out for our own. And today, that included you. We never leave a sister behind. It was a simple phrase, a common saying in the military. But hearing it applied to her, a civilian mother, made her heart swell. She realized that she wasn't just an observer anymore. Because her son had chosen this path, because he had committed his life to service, she had been adopted into this massive, complicated, wonderful family. These strangers were willing to fight for her simply because she was the mother of a Marine. Take care of each other, the man said, giving them a final nod. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel, rejoining his team without looking for applause or praise. She watched him go for a moment, then took her son's arm. Ready to go home? She asked. Home sounds perfect, he said. They walked to the car in the silence of the evening. They didn't need to talk much anymore. The chaos of the day, the fear, the anger, and the heroism had all settled into a quiet memory. As they drove out of the main gate, passing the armed sentries who saluted the car, she looked in the rearview mirror one last time at the base. She thought about the guard who had tried to ruin the day. He was a small man in a big uniform, someone who let authority blind him to decency. And then she thought about the 12 men who weren't even supposed to be there. They didn't have uniforms on. They didn't have badges. But they had something much stronger. They had honor. She reached over and squeezed her son's hand as he drove. He looked over at her and smiled, that tired, happy smile. Mom. Yeah, honey. I'm really hungry. Can we stop for burgers? She laughed, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. We can get whatever you want. We can get the whole menu. They drove off into the night, leaving the base behind them. But they carried the strength of the day with them. They knew that no matter what life threw at them, no matter who tried to push them down, they would never be alone. There would always be someone there to stand in the gap, to block the view of the troublemakers, and to make sure the light got through. And that was the best graduation gift of all.